Howdy, folks. Welcome back to JJ's Library and Readings. Here you are. Sunday fun day, right? Uh, Hope y'all are enjoying the book so far. I'm having a really good time with it. Today is just a little short episode. I try to keep these intros short. Um, in reality, I probably would like them shorter than I do make them, but I like to think I'm different than, other reading book channels, so hopefully I add a little flair or something noticeable. So, hope you're comfy in your couch or your bed or wherever you may be, drinking your hot coffee or hot cider. I've been wanting some hot cider, but today I got some hot coffee with me just made. And you're able to smoke your cob or smoke whatever you got. Smoke them if you got them. That's what had an old guy at work say that to me. Well, older than me, but he wasn't that old. Either way, y'all didn't come here for that. You came here for the story. So, we're back. Between Two Fires, Chapter 10 of the Battle of Crecy. It had rained. Just a quick August shower when it was gone, and everything smelled like a late summer with it that hit damp and rot. The farms of Picardy were stumbled upon where the wheat and barley had already been mowed. The ground was moist, and Thomas could smell the good black soil of his home province, even after the equally pleasant noise of horses in oiled steel. His lord, the Comte de Grivas, had sued for the pleasure of being in the first line of knights to charge the English where they set themselves on the field of Crecy, which meant he sued for Thomas's right to be there too. They drew up in the first line of attack along the Elysion, the king's brother, and came up to the edge of the field, looking at their adversaries. The invaders under King Edward of England had backed themselves up a terraced slope between two copses of trees, with a bank with a drop the height of a man, revealed itself as the French host drew up to attack the English lines. The knights of France would have to ride around to where it flattened out, which was only about 80 yards from another run of trees, and then mount the hill. It was a funnel. It was a trap. The crossbowmen, mostly little Geocies mercenaries, whom the French called Selamis, went out first at the king's command. They were bitching because the big shields they hid behind while reloading hadn't come forward yet, and their hempen strings were wet from the rain. Besides, it was late in the day, and they still have to shoot uphill and into the sun. They wanted to wait for their pevices. They wanted to wait until the morning when the sun would confound English arrows. King Philip told them that they would have worse than arrows to deal with if they didn't do their work tonight. But as the French were all about to find out, the king didn't have anything worse than arrows. The Salamis came back running about 10 minutes, more than a few of them bloodied and stuck with feathers. Thomas would always remember how one had an arrow stuck straight through his hand and was waving it out as if it were on fire and he might put it out. A French knight yelled, "They've switched sides!" Another yelled, "Cowards!" And soon the impatient knights were riding over to the Genos through the narrow pass to get at the English. Some even struck down at the fleeing men, but Thomas Lord did not. So neither did Thomas. They rode hard at the line of English knights who were standing at the top of their tawny slope like bait. They were standing with the poleaxes and swords, confident the French would not release them in any shape to hurt them. They were flying the banner of the dragon. As the French were flying, the sacred red oriflamme, which the Valos king had fetched with the great ceremony from Saint Denis, both banners meant the same thing: no quarter. Thomas's seigneur went at the English king, whose camp sat at the large windmill, or at his son of the Prince of Wales. He wanted to punish them for the insult of their small numbers. The French had them 3-1, as men at arms went. Most knights, lords of manors and castles, large and small, from the breadth of France, had only contempt for the rows of farmer soldiers arranged in wedge formations between the English knights. but Thomas's blood wasn't so far above theirs, and he had a bad feeling. The archers were standing like dogs at the crouch with their long bows strung in little fences of arrows stuck into the ground at their feet. They were waiting. Thomas guessed that they had picked a landmark to range their first flight. Now they had to let loose when the French vanguard passed it. Now the hill got steep and took the speed out of their charge, the horses sweating and blowing out their nostrils. Thomas looked at a knobby shrub jutting out and thought, "That's it," even as Aislon's horse drew beside it. The English archers, rough ploughmen from Lancaster, to Kent with over-muscled right shoulders had no feeling in the first three fingers, sank into their hips and pulled their heavy bowstrings back to their ears, as did the pale dark-haired Welsh bowmen in their party-colored green and white, some 5,000 archers in all. They loosed. Thomas couldn't hear the slap of those bows through the padded entail and hem, but he saw the arrows rise like a swarm of flies and then came down. He had no visor. Many men who had them didn't push them down in time. The arrows fell hard with a noise like hail on tails, but also sick and wet where one slammed through chainmail or into horse flesh. Men gasped and swore and screamed, and the horses' screams were worse. They bucked and reared and bit at the arrows sticking in them. Some turned their haunches and ran, while others lay down and refused to move again. Many fell and pitched their hiders. The French line was dissolving, and they weren't halfway to their enemy. Thomas saw that his lord was riding crooked in his saddle, and then he saw two shafts sticking out of the older man. Both in the chest, the older man would have fallen, but for the deep saddle and high pommel made excessively to keep knights cinched in place. Thomas raised his lance and couched the butt in its feuter, reaching out to grab the reins of the Comet's horse, and then an arrow went whang on his lord's conical helm, and he felt a hard slap on his face, like from his mother's spoon in the kitchen. Suddenly, he was leaning back, almost out of the saddle, looking out at the clouds, but his eyes weren't focused right because there was something white in the sky, fletching. He had an arrow in the face. He sat up, and the pain hit him so hard he dropped his lance and almost passed out, but he didn't. The horses had both stopped. His seigneur was slumped to one side in danger of falling. Thomas tried to speak, but only blood came out of his mouth. The point was in his tongue. What was left of the French line, maybe 4 dozen knights in the Comte de Alençon, was pulling towards the English, their backs receding as they rode to die. As the remnants of the French vanguard closed, the English began to touch off crude cannons, sending brass stone balls whizzing into men, sending limbs and scraps of armor and fabric in all directions, sending gouts of smoke skyward. The banging cracks like near thunder further terrified the injured horses. One knight to Thomas's left, whose surcoat blazed with these 3 crescent moon argent, tried to regain control of his mount, which was kicking madly with a half-dozen shafts in him. The horse kicked Thomas's leg and broke it even though the grieve. Then, his eyes as wide as goose eggs, threw his rider off and stamped the man's helmeted head into the mud again and again with his front hoofs, destroying it utterly. Then he lay down and died on what remained of his master. He was not alone. One Englishman would later say the dead horses were lined up like piglets to suckle. Thomas grabbed again for his lord's reins, using the roll of his spurs to guide his own horse, and turned them both away. The Comte de Gravis groaned, as if in disappointment, and another shaft caught him in the back. Thomas spurred them both for the French lines, but the next wave of knights was charging at them, shouting, "Saint Denis, in glory!" They were beautiful in their surcoats of many colors, a flock of exotic birds heading for Bird Lime. Some of them were dying already, as the arrows were falling their way now. Only the fact that the archers preferred charging knights to retreating ones saved Thomas and his lord from being riddled. The relentless rain of arrows had also opened up big enough holes in the ranks for the 2 men to pass through, although one knight in robin's egg blue glance against Thomas so hard he knocked him into his seigneur. He nearly fell again. He was shaking his head, ashamed not to be dying on the field, but he was certainly dying. The little page, Renaud, and Thomas's squire, Andre, ran up with a barber surgeon, who held up an injured man off all their mounts. Thomas was nauseated from pain and all the blood he had swallowed, and the eye from above the arrow wouldn't stop tearing. The surgeon used a pair of shears to cut the arrow on the Camute's back so he could lay down to die. The Camute de Grevas was a more important man than Thomas, but the surgeon attended Thomas because he saw that he might live. He pulled the big man down and wedged a stone between his back teeth to keep his mouth open. The cut from his quarter's mouth, forcing the shears and snap half the draft. He got the point out of the tongue. Nothing had ever hurt Thomas so badly. Then pulled the shaft up the cheek. His hands were slimy with blood, and his grip kept slipping. He would have stitched Thomas, but someone had him by the sleeve now, shouting, "The king's musician is hurt! The king commands you!" And he was gone. The page held the signor's hand. As Thomas heard his awful breathing, he was drowning. He died clenching his teeth and shivering. He was awake until the very end and knew what was happening to him, but he did not cry out. Thomas did, as much to see the great man was dead as for his own pain. It was the worst day he had ever known. With the squire's help, Thomas sat up and watched the second wave fail too, though some had gotten close enough to exchange blows near the banner of the Prince of Wales. Soon they were finished, and Lowell followed. Now bare-legged Welshmen ran from the English lines and stuck knives into the eyes and visors of the stunned knights on the ground, killing them as easily as boys crab hunting. Thomas's eye was hemming itself shut as the injured side of his face swelled. Men who passed them did not recognize him. Now a man wearing the king's livery came and took both Thomas's warhorse, who was lathered in sweat and stooping his head, and his mild-mannered palfrey, who always did a side-to-side dance when he smelled lettuce. He never saw either horse again. The sun went down, and still the beaten French railed again and again to ride into the gloaming. Thomas had a moment's hope that he saw the windmill near the English king on fire, its great spars turning ablaze like a show wheel and harrow. But the English had burned the windmill to smiles to give the archers light to murder by. It had been dark for an hour when the call came to flee. There had been no more French charges. The English were coming down from their Terrace Hill, and there was nothing to stop them. Thomas was suddenly aware of being alone. He did not know where his squire was, and could not remember the last time he had seen him. The cries of wounded men being killed on the ground grew closer, and as the rude, chopping language of their killers, confident now, calling out to one another. Thomas sat up as best he could, with the sword pointed behind him, ready to take the leg off a Welshman before he died. He heard hoofs and wondered if an English knight was about to spit him. He turned his head. Here was his squire with the horse, a tired old nag from the baggage trains. Thomas tried to speak, but kept with his swollen tongue touched his palate. Andre made a shushing gesture, and some effort got Thomas up and then on the nag's broad back. He leapt in front of his master and bore Thomas's great weight on his back as he took the reins, and they cantered away from Crecy and Pothintu. The night was very dark. The nameless horse sometimes pitched to avoid the body of one who had tried to flee, but succumbed to his wounds. So many had died that Thomas could not comprehend it. The plain below the English position would be known as the Valley of Clerks, for it would take an army of men with pens and field desks to record the names and titles of the French dead. It was at the town of Amiens where Thomas conversated his squire, having paid a good surgeon to see him. A good thing is that a bodkin point on that shaft, the surgeon had said as he put first wine and then egg white in the punctured cheek. A broadhead would have never came out. As it is, I scared that tongue will sour and kill you, so I'm tempted to have it off. But then what would you do, or what would you have to pray with? Before he pulled the tooth, whose roots were knocked loose by the arrow, then stitched the tongue and face, the surgeon told the squire to hold Thomas's head still. Thomas grunted something. That's what they all say, he said. But he'll hold you just the same, and if your lordship bites me, I'll yank a good tooth as well. It had taken less than an hour, but it was the longest hour Thomas could recall. The 10 minutes he took to set the leg seemed merely purgatorial after the hell of little pliers fishing in the cheek for loose bone, and the dip and bite of the curved needle in his tongue. You'll not be so pretty now, but you may live to thank the Virgin if she saves you. The pain's a good sign. I'll come around again tomorrow night, splash some more wine on that around supper time, but no supper for you till Tuesday, and then only broth and raw eggs. God felt so bad about throwing man out of the garden, he gave us the chicken, which gave us the egg. Wouldn't surprise me to find out angel's blood was egg whites. God rest you, Sir Knight. The squire stayed with Thomas for 2 weeks while the arrow wound toyed with his life, first reddening around the margins, then running clear, then slowly, very slowly beginning to heal. When he was out of danger, though still not well enough to travel, he sent his squire home to tell the lady of the manor he was alive. The Sinskale, who had been watching for Sir Thomas, stopped Andre at the gate and told him that had happened. The squire turned around quickly and rode hard for Amiens. Andre stood in the little room with his hat in his hands and his hood thrown back. He measured the words and spoke to them slowly, pausing before the worst ones. Sire, your keep in the lands of Apretil are forfeit to the Comte de Irex of Navarre and Normandy. Your Sinskale made to stand against him and prepared for siege. But your wife, fearing the comet's cruelty, should be breach the walls, treated with Diarmix to let him into your keep. And it seems, after very little struggle, her bed, your son, however, has been declared by the comet the lord of the manor, and stands to inherit when he becomes to maturity. Diarmix in the interval is regent and protector, and your rents will go to him. Save money for your lady to keep a modest household. Thomas shook his bandaged head and said words that sounded like the king. The king is weak now. The lords of Normandy scheme against him and treat with England. King Philip gave your fallen lord's lands to Grievous to the Norman to keep him from rising in plain revolt. And now he has seized yours, which order Grievous, because he can. Because you were faithful to your seigneur, and he was faithful to the defeated king, you have been moved aside. Thomas shook his head in agony, his eyes tearing. Further, the squire said, you are declared excommunicate. The bishop of Leon himself has ordered it. Against the protest of your priest, they will strip of your spurs and abstasia, empty the chalice, and lay down the cross. If ever you return to try to claim your land back, the priest must deny the people the sacraments as well. Thomas made a sound that might have been when. The ceremony is tomorrow. And so Thomas had healed. When his money ran out, he went west to Normandy and sold his soul to Godfrey, watching always for the heretic Christ of the men who had ruined him. Charitin, Comte de Erex, the gold on red wheel of Spain, quartered with a barrel field of fleurs de lis. Thomas agreed to stay with the brigands so long as they stayed in High Normandy. Godfrey agreed that they would often visit the Comet domain. Thomas swore that this grasping lord, with lands in Spain, Normandy, and Picardy, who had his piggish eyes even on the crown of France, would die in the mud at a Bigard's hands. He swore it, spat on a cross, and flung it down. Since God had permitted his excommunication, he had earned it. Thomas never thought of the kind of man to take part in thief and killings and to permit rape, but in the name of revenge he became exactly that kind of man. For a time. Good chapter. Short chapter. That was a good chapter. I really enjoyed it. I hope y'all did too. I know it's stuttering a little bit. I don't know what was going on in that chapter. But, again, that's why I said, have your books with you. Because I am, let's be honest, not the best at reading. But I really enjoy this. And I hope you guys at least enjoy me too. Even if it's just a put on. Maybe even before sleeping. I hope maybe that can be enjoyable. So, like always, good morning, good evening, and good night. I'll see y'all tomorrow.